Professor Rochman is an assistant professor in ecology at the University of Toronto. She's been researching the sources, sinks, and ecological implications of plastic debris in marine and freshwater habitats for the past decade. She has published dozens of scientific papers in respected journals and has led international working groups about plastic pollution. In addition to her research, Chelsea works to translate her science beyond academia. For example, Chelsea presented her work to the United Nations General Assembly and at the United States State Department. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rochman.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. So there are some collaborators in the room and friendly faces, and then people I haven't met yet. So I'm excited to have a chance to chat later. I'm going to talk about my research program. I'm going to share data that we haven't published yet, so you're going to get some sneak peeks of local data because I wanted to talk primarily about what we see in this region. So I'll kind of start with an overview of the issue. I'll talk about some local data, and then I'll talk about some of the things that we can do about it. I just want to quickly mention that I am a professor at the University of Toronto. I also work very closely with a nonprofit organization, Ocean Conservancy, and also run an outreach program called the UOT Trash Team. And Lauren Eade, who's sitting in this room, is also a student in the lab and has done some of the work I'll talk about today. So when I got interested in the issue of plastic, I wasn't thinking about plastic in freshwater watersheds. I wasn't in the Great Lakes. I was in California in undergrad and then in grad school. And I had learned about the issue because I had heard about the garbage patch. And so some people become familiar with the issue of plastic pollution because they learn about this floating island of trash twice the size of Texas, floating in the middle of the Pacific. Of course, we know now it doesn't look like this, and we've learned a lot about it since then. So this was 2006 when the garbage patch was introduced in the Los Angeles Times, or the LA Times. Fast forward to today, we can see that there's been a lot more information understood about plastic in the ocean. So this is what the issue that sparked my interest in becoming a scientist, as well as several others. And you can see that just in the last decade, can you guys hear me if I walk away from the podium? Okay. So you can see that over time, the literature has just started to really increase. And this number would be even larger if we were to continue it through 2019. And so the science on this issue has really exploded. And we've really come to understand that this is not a garbage patch problem. It's not just an ocean problem. That plastic pollution is a global problem, and that it's both the big plastics, so the big nets and the bottles and the bags and the products that we're familiar with, but it's also the majority is microplastic. And so what I'm going to talk a lot about today is the small stuff, less than about 5 millimeters in size, that we tend to study a lot in our lab. And we know now that microplastics has become this kind of global pollutant. So just like we think of PCBs and pesticides and flame retardants, we think of microplastics and that they're persistent, they're organic, and they transport in some of the same ways as these contaminants. So they do make it out to the ocean, but they come from the land, they come via watersheds, they cycle in the atmosphere, and they get into our wastewater. And I just want to make it clear that they're incredibly diverse. So can I just turn this off? Sorry. I feel like I'm going back and forth. It's distracting me. Yeah, and I'm kind of loud, so I don't really need it. So I just want to make a point that when we talk about microplastics, we're talking about this really diverse material. So the microbeads put microplastics on the map. Those are those small polyethylene particles that were added to face wash that have since been banned in Canada. I've spoken to some scientists and they say, well, we banned the microbeads, so the microplastic issue is over. The reality is there's a lot of different types of microplastics out there. So the microbeads fall under this primary category in that they're particles of plastic that have broken, that were made to be small. But the majority of what we see out there are broken down bits of the bigger litter that end up in the environment. And they include lots of different shapes, and the reason we categorize them by shape is it helps us tell something about their type. If they're a fiber, they might be something shed from textiles. If they're foam, they might come from expanded polystyrene foam. The pellets sometimes come straight from industry, or the scrap that comes from the production line, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's lots of different polymer types. You guys, maybe some of you in this room probably know more about this than I do, but there's a lot of different types of plastic out there that are molded and made into different plastic types. Different chemicals are added to them to make them flexible, more persistent, give them a color, make them flame retardant, and then they range in size from the nanometer to the micrometer scale, to the millimeter scale actually. So when we talk about microplastics, we're talking about this really diverse material. And so the question is kind of, how did we get here? How did we get to a day where this material, microplastics, has become this ubiquitous pollutant from a day when plastic was really celebrated as this material that was coming out into the world? And so this is the cover of Life magazine around the 50s that's celebrating the rise of the convenience that is single-use plastics, and talking about how this housewife can now have 200 people to her house, she can have a dinner party, and at the end of the day she can throw it all away. And there's a lot of convenience to these materials. There's also a lot of greatness to a lot of plastics. It makes airplanes lighter, it's great in hospitals. But unfortunately, the production has increased substantially and the waste management hasn't really kept up with it. And so in this day we produced about 500,000 tons per year. Today we produce about 380 million tons per year. The majority, or not the majority, but 40% of which are some of these single-use items. And so when we look at our waste management associated with this material, we know that we've produced about 8,300 million metric tons over all of the years. We know that some of that is still in use. You're sitting in front of a plastic table, on a plastic chair. I have plastic on my eyeglasses. But only about 9 or 10% of that has actually been recycled. So when we talk about a circular economy, we're not doing very well. Some of it has been incinerated, which is the only loss to the system. And then more than half of it is discarded. While some of that is a landfill, which can range from highly engineered to a dump, some of that goes out into the environment. And while we don't know quite how much goes to managed versus mismanaged, we know that we see images like this all over the world. And they're not unique just to the developing world. We have some locations like that right here at home. And we estimate that about 8 million metric tons enters into the ocean each year and into our Great Lakes, and I should have wrote this down, I'm probably going to mess this up, but I think it's 10,000 metric tons is what is estimated to go into our Great Lakes each year by Matthew Hoffman, who's at RIT. And so this plastic goes into the ocean, or it goes into the lake, and we suspect that 8 million metric tons comes from this improperly mismanaged waste, but we still are trying to understand where all the other sources come from. Because it's important to think about how much goes in, but if we want to cut it off, we have to know where it comes from. So how much comes from mismanaged waste, and if we had more waste management, what would we stop? How much is coming from wastewater treatment plants? How much is coming from things going on at sea, including the scientists? How much is spilling from shipping, fishing and aquaculture, lost pellets, and then catastrophic events? I don't think we often think about how much might enter from a tsunami, a hurricane, whatever it is. That's quite a lot, and that's an event that we can do less about. So we try to understand the sources, and at the moment, we're basically just confident-ish about that number. So here in North America, including right here in Toronto, we tried to understand something about the sources when it comes to microplastics. And so I started a project during my postdoc and continued working on it with Yelena, who was in my lab until about a week ago. And we're measuring the sources in the sinks of microplastics in our watersheds. And so we chose 4 to see if the patterns were consistent over space. We were looking in the California Delta, where I used to live, in the Chesapeake Bay, in the Mississippi watershed, as well as right here in Lake Ontario. And what we did is we sampled from wastewater treatment plants, so the STRARs, from agricultural sites up here in these watersheds, from urbanized watershed sites, so where you have large urban centers emptying out into the river, and then we sampled in the lake to see, does what we find in the lake match with any of these different sources? Can we understand what the sources are? We find that there's microplastics in all of the different types of samples, with the majority in the stormwater runoff, so that urban runoff, and in the wastewater treatment plants. And when we look at the different categories or the different shapes, we can see that in the wastewater, we find mostly fibers. So when we think about the textiles, that's mostly in our wastewater. Agriculture, urban runoff, and reference site, the lake, are a bit of a mixed bag. But you see this black here, which is the tire dust, or the rubber, the wear that's coming from our cars and likely from the road as well. And I'll walk you through what this is, but this is just trying to say, do you see similarities across these sites? So this is just a simple, it's not simple, but this is an NMDS plot, which all it is doing is saying when things are similar, we're going to put them together. And so you can see that the ag sites are squares, the circles are the lake, the triangles are stormwater, and the diamonds are wastewater. And when it comes to just the shape and color, you can see that the different sources group, and that what we see in the lake, the circles, is more similar to the urban runoff, so what's running off of the road. I think it's not the fibers, because fibers tend to sink, and we're sampling the surface water. And when it comes to polymer types, there's absolutely no trend. As I said before, there's so many different kinds, and that's what we find in our watershed. So you can see there's lots of different types of polymers that we're finding, but nothing really kind of sticks out amongst sites, except for maybe, again, that rubber in the stormwater. Point is to say, we have sources entering our watershed. We can try to figure out a little bit about what they are. They're incredibly diverse, but this gives us some information to try to think about, if we wanted to cut it off at the source, where we might do that. And so then we try to correlate these with things that might be going on in the watershed as well. So what's a little bit interesting is that you can see a positive correlation with increasing population. That's no surprise. You have more people, you use more plastics, more enter the watershed. You have that same correlation with urban, that's also population. We have this strong correlation with the plastic industry. And I want to show that because we actually find quite a lot of pellets and scraps right here in Toronto. And we see that in this study, as well as in a study which I'll show some data in a second, that where you tend to find a lot of it tends to be in close proximity to some of these industries that are either converting the pellets into products or making the pellets. And so I'll come back to that in a little bit when I talk about some of this contamination. So you have all of these sources entering the water, then you have contamination. The contamination globally is diverse in terms of in different ecosystems. So we find it in the deep sea chair at the bottom of the Monterey Bay Canyon. We find it in coral reefs. But what I really am mostly going to talk about today is that we also find it right here in freshwater ecosystems in our Great Lakes. And so to talk to you a little bit about the big stuff that goes into the small stuff that enters into the water, we've also done some waste audits in collaboration with ports in the fact that they just let us take the trash from their boom, put it out on the concrete, and we sorted it. So this was a hot, smelly day. Lauren, were you here? No. It was a hot, smelly day where we were sorting through the logs and the trash, but it was incredibly powerful in that we got to see what is coming down the Don River. What are the types of trash that we're seeing, and how can we think about maybe policies that are relevant to some of these types. So we sorted through all of the litter. We found lots of styrofoam or expanded polystyrene pieces, lots of fragments, but then you can see a lot of those single-use items. Our next items are plastic water bottles and bottle caps, which often go together. Lots of food wrappers, tons of balls. This was weird. 53 balls, like soccer balls and tennis balls and things like this, but we're on a ravine. Cigarette butts, which are often quite common, plastic straws, plastic bags. And so this is just to try to understand what's coming directly from our rivers and our city in terms of the big stuff that might be turning into the small stuff. And here is what we find when it comes to the small stuff. So this is not my data. This comes from Paul Helm from the Ministry of the Environment, but he let me share it. And basically each bar is a different sample. So 3 samples were taken at each of these sites. Here is the stuff around here in Toronto. You can see how many millions of microplastics are found per square kilometer of water. I will tell you that when you compare this to the garbage patches in the oceans, the concentrations are quite large in some areas. And just to give you kind of a peek of what they are, The majority of them are fragments. We do find microbeads. This is older data. Those microbeads are starting to go away as we have the regulations, so that's a good sign. Lines and fibers comes from fishing in the wastewater treatment plants, foam, film, etc. So we have it in our water. We also have it in our sediments. So this again is not my data. This is published data by Patricia Corcoran's lab at Western. This is the data where they look in the harbor, they look Humber, they look different locations around here. This is sediment. They quantify the amount of microplastics in the sediment, and the concentrations correlate as well again with the amount of industry that's up in the Etobicoke watershed and in Mimico watershed. And when we go down to Humber Bay Park West, we can see a lot of those pellets in the soil. So that's something I just wanted to mention because it's relevant to this group when we think about what can we do about it. So you have this contamination in the water. As an ecologist, we care about this because we say, okay, how does it contaminate wildlife? In the Great Lakes, we don't know a ton in terms of wildlife. We're starting to understand. So what this is saying is that overall globally, we know that more than 800 species have either been entangled by it, ingested, or smothered by it. Not necessarily always a harmful effect, just that they have this contamination, they're exposed. And then more than 220 species ingest microplastics. Again, this is data that's published around the world. I want to show you some local data that's, again, not quite published yet, but we're working on it. So this is data from fish taken from near shore right off of Toronto. And you can see the microplastics, the counts in the fish, sometimes go up into the hundreds, especially in the benthic fish. And you can see that the majority of them are fibers and fragments. Now, I've done similar work like this in California, where I've looked in ocean fish, and we find plastic in about 1 in 4 fish, and maybe about 2 to 20 pieces per fish. And so just to show you here at home, we have a less dilute, smaller body of water surrounded by big cities. We tend to find more in our fish. These are nearshore fish. My student Lisa Ertl looks at offshore fish. She finds microfibers in about every fish, or in every fish that she samples. The majority of them are microfibers, but she does find some of the other types. These are offshore. And so here you see something a little bit different than the nearshore fish. And then an undergraduate student in the lab, Cole Brookson, has a paper that's about to come out and for publication looking at cormorants. We collaborated with Environment Canada. They gave us the gut contents of cormorants that they sample around Hamilton Harbor. They were looking at whether or not when the adults feed their chicks, whether they're regurgitating plastic to their young. And he found plastic in not every, but almost every bird. And the majority of it was small plastic, like the microfibers and the little bits. And we think, because the way cormorants feed is they feed on fish, and so because we found these little types instead of the big stuff that we see in their nests, maybe it's trophic transfer from the fish that they eat, but again, we don't know, and it's a hypothesis we'd love to test. So when you talk about contamination in wildlife, policymakers always want to talk about how it impacts humans. I'm not a human toxicologist. I don't research that type of thing, but I have looked in seafood and drinking water to see whether or not there's microplastic there, to think about whether or not we're exposed. And so we know that there's microplastics in fish that we eat, although in the gut content. There's microplastics in shellfish, for which we do eat the whole thing, in sea salt, and in drinking water. So my colleague Bob Andrews, who's in the drinking water research group at the University of Toronto, wanted to work with me on this, and I said, I don't think there's microplastics in drinking water. I don't really know that we should go down this road. He convinced me. I learned more about how drinking water is processed, where it comes from. We sampled across different areas in the treatment train, so when it comes into the system from the lake, when it's settled, filtered, and finished water going out for distribution, we find microplastics in all of the samples. But one thing I want to note here is don't get too freaked out by the numbers. 37% of what we see are cellulose fibers. Some of these are natural. So what we're saying is this is everything that we picked from a sample that we suspect is microplastics. Only some of them are your anthropogenic particles. Some of them are cellulose and minerals. So the question is, does it matter? If you have it in wildlife, if humans are exposed, does it actually cause an effect? And so we know that it's quite easy to think about an animal being entangled by the large stuff, but can you have a physical effect from the small stuff? And then we know that plastics are associated with lots of different chemicals from manufacturing. Plus, when they enter the water, they start to accumulate the chemicals around it. Is this question of, are they a source of the chemicals to wildlife, and does that cause an effect? So when it comes to a potential type of effect, is it could happen based on the fate of a small microplastic and a physical effect, or shuttling a chemical into the body. So we know from laboratory studies that small microplastics, 20 micron and smaller, can translocate into the blood cell of a mussel, so a bivalve, or into the liver and the kidney of a mouse. We've done similar tests with rainbow trout in the lab with 10 micron and above pieces. We saw no translocation. We saw it in the gut. We saw nothing in the fillet, nothing in the gonads, nothing in the liver. So it seems that the size of the particle really matters, and probably the species matters. But the question is, when you have that translocation, does it cause an impact, or does it shuttle a chemical into the animal? So plastics enter water. They can leach the chemicals associated with them, or an animal can eat it, and the chemical can leach into their body. The chemicals could transfer up the food web, and the question is, does that cause an effect? A lot of this is work that is still being done, and it's still questions we're trying to answer, but we do know that plastics can be a source of chemicals to wildlife. So a colleague in South Korea sampled mussels that lived on styrofoam buoys and sampled mussels that lived on a pier. The mussels that lived on the pier had very little flame retardants. The mussels that lived on the buoy, so he had the mussels on metal, on rock, and on polyethylene. Those that lived on the expanded polystyrofoam had much higher concentrations of flame retardants than the others, and then the foam itself had HBCD. Now you're wondering, why would a buoy be flame retardant? Well, sometimes if the recycling codes aren't up to snuff, a foam that had it in it can be recycled into something that doesn't need it. And I don't know how much this happens here in North America, but they report this problem in South Korea, and sometimes they even see it in like the styrofoam that's used for fish in the grocery store. So it's something that they're mindful of. And then we have seen correlations between the amount of plastic in fish in the gyres, so in those garbage patches, and the amount of flame retardant in the fish, and found those flame retardants on the plastic and not in their prey. Just to show you that it can be a source of chemicals, which is why we ask these questions about effects. So this is going to be the most technical thing I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to walk you through it. But when we try to understand what do we know about the effects of plastic in the ocean, we ask, what is the evidence in the literature? So if I go into the scientific literature and I pull out all the papers that are relevant, what do I see in terms of demonstrated effects of plastic at different sizes, from the nanoscale to the kilometer, like a fishing net scale, across different levels of biological organization? The top ones are the ones that are more relevant to the ecosystem. So the actual organism, can it be the cause of death? Does it change the size of a population, increasing it by giving it place to lay its eggs, or decreasing it by maybe changing reproductive success? And does it alter the community of species? Then these are all the physiologically, when I look in an organism, do I see an effect? And so you can see that when we went through the literature through 2013, there's not very dark shading, there's not a lot of evidence of effect, and when there is dark shading, it's just 6 to 10 observations. And so we made a call for more research. My student Kennedy and I are going back through this. We've now seen that the evidence of impact is growing, especially at the higher levels of organization, and particularly for microplastics. But what's interesting, this is, somebody tested a hypothesis about an effect, and they demonstrated one or detected one. Here, somebody tested a hypothesis about an effect and didn't find one. So for macroplastic, you can see that the majority of times an effect is demonstrated. But for microplastics, it's about equal whether you see one or you don't. And so the question is why? And so I think when we say, is microplastic hazardous? Does microplastic harm wildlife? The because there's so many different types of microplastics, we may not be asking the right questions. We don't say, do pesticides in general harm aquatic ecosystems? We say, does this particular one esphenvalorate or whatever it is? And so when it comes to microplastic, I think it depends on the type, the size, the shape, the organism that's used, how much they dose them with, and the length of exposure. So we've been trying to dig deeper into the literature to understand this. And so my student Kennedy has been using fathead minnow, which are an important prey fish in our ecosystems here, and exposing them to different types of plastic. So she's used polyethylene and polypropylene, and then she samples polyethylene and polypropylene from the lake, from the beach, to see how the environmentally exposed plastic fares compared to the clean one from the store, basically, because this will have accumulated those contaminants from nature. She exposes them to larval fish. So of course we have a control because we want to know how are the fish doing normally. Then we expose them to the plastic. They can bump into it, they can ingest it. We give them a concentration that's on the high side of what's been found in nature, and then something really high. But then we also expose them to the plastic where it's like walled off from the fish, and the only thing they can be exposed to is any chemicals that leach from it. So this was a 14-day test, just seeing how the larvae fared. She's now doing a full life cycle assessment, and tomorrow the fish will be a month old out of like 6 months. It's a long experiment. But just to show you the data from the shorter one, I'm not showing you polypropylene because we saw absolutely no effect. For polyethylene, in the high physical treatment where they could eat the material, we see a significant increase in mortality or death of the fish, meaning they're not surviving to become an adult. And then in the beach plastic, so the same types of plastic but with this addition of the chemicals, we don't see a significant increase in mortality, but we see this pattern of increase across all of the plastic treatments. But in both the chemical and the physical effect, we see these deformities. And so we see fish with weird edemas or weird kind of like growths or pockets of air or fluids in their body. We see spinal bending, which is not normal. You don't want to see this in a juvenile fish. And then we see ocular enlargement and weird growth. So I'm not sure if that's, I don't know what that is, whether it's a tumor or not, because we haven't looked at it under a microscope to look at the histology. But you can see that its tail has like this red growth on it. And so from here we say, okay, we see these impacts to the larval fish. It seems to vary by plastic type. How does that impact them on a full life cycle in terms of whether they grow up, how they reproduce, etc. So we continue to do experiments to try to understand ecological effects in a lab and also trying to understand in a field. We are in the process of planning a whole ecosystem experiment at the Experimental Lakes area in western Ontario, where we're trying to figure out if we can dose a lake with microplastics, how does that actually impact the populations, the communities, and ecosystem processes. I personally don't work on impacts to humans, but there are other people trying to do it. And when they try to think about this, they think about whether or not it has ecological impacts, which reduce fish stocks, whether it causes a food safety issue, or whether it changes the nutritional value of food because an animal eats plastic and is missing that nutritional normal diet. Again, I don't study this, but someone called my office the other day and wanted to give me 200 stool samples from people. I don't think we're ready for Lauren's face. I don't think we're ready for that yet. But it's interesting in that they have all the epidemiological data, right? So there's part of me that's like, that's really cool. Somebody else will certainly do that. And hopefully that gives us some information. So in summary on the science, we know that there's widespread contamination in habitats and animals, and this includes seafood and drinking water. So is it out there? Is it a contaminant? Yes, it's global. There are evidence of effects to wildlife, particularly for the big stuff, the bags, the nets. And this includes to populations and communities. But when it comes to microplastics, there are evidence of impacts from laboratory studies, but I would certainly argue that we need a better understanding of why and what type and what matters in terms of in nature. And so we'll continue to try to understand this, as well as continue to try to understand the sources, as well as when it gets out there, where does it go? But at the same time, I would say, oh no, let me go over this first before I say that. So these are some of the next big questions and research needs for microplastics that I have came up with, but also in working groups, people have come up with. We need to understand where they're coming from if we want to cut it off at the source. We need to understand the fate of the microplastics and the chemicals in the environment. We need to know whether there are environmental effects, ecologically relevant effects in nature, human health and food safety, and the biggest thing, in my opinion at the moment, is improving our methods to better quantify it and characterize it. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of time under a microscope, it takes a lot of time on an FTIR or a Raman to type the plastics, and so trying to come up with better methods is something we spend a lot of time on. So this is what I was going to say earlier, that while we still have a lot of questions to answer, I really do believe that we know enough to begin to mitigate and prevent the issue before it does get worse. And so now I'll spend some time talking about solutions. How am I in time? I don't have a little timer. Okay.
It's 8:28.
Which I have until
1:45.
Okay, good. So just a broad overview of what's going on in terms of solutions. Some of you are signed on to the Ocean Plastics Charter. That's at the regional level. I'd say right now we're starting to see policy changes at the local level. So, and I'd even go down to like this individual level, municipality level, states, provinces, and then you have countries, regional, international. And so banning the microbeads, this happened at the country level in many different locations around the world. And we're starting to see regional and global level changes. So when I first started working on this issue, nobody thought it was a real issue. We were thinking about the big stuff. Ocean Conservancy was out there picking it up. So were other organizations. But on a policy level on the global stage, it wasn't really getting much attention. And when I talked to scientists, they would say, oh, we throw plastic off the boat. It's really no big deal. And now I think that's dramatically changed. There are conversations going on at the UN level. In the Sustainable Development Goals, there's wording about plastic pollution, and the first international initiative, the Clean Seas Initiative, has happened at the United Nations, and there are conversations about a potential international agreement that's a bit more binding than something that's completely voluntary here. And so the question is, if we're going to go to an international agreement, or we're going to try to spark conversations about solutions across the global stage, we need to know what are those solutions that we're going to do in order to reduce our emissions or reduce the amount of plastic that goes out into the environment. And so all of you are probably familiar with the waste hierarchy, potentially more familiar than I am. I've been at many meetings where lots of people stress this. One of the top, the most favored option is often reduce. We reduce our use of the material, which is something that is possible and something that people at certain places are working on, and it's in the Ocean Charter. We can reuse, so trying to build a more circular economy, and recycle, so there's some interesting stuff happening here. And I think there was an article yesterday about the loop system where Unilever and some other brands are going to actually have reusable materials in the stores where you can come pick up your container, use it, bring it back. So you pay a fee to borrow it, you return it, you get it back, and then it never becomes waste, which is really neat. So they're going to pilot that here at home. And then as you get lower on the waste hierarchy, then you have the recovery to energy and then landfill. And so trying to work on some of these solutions at the top to produce a more circular economy. This isn't really what we do, right? We're not policy people, we're ecologists, but right now I have this project with Succinct, led by Steph Burrell, where we're trying to use population modeling from ecology to treat the plastic as an animal in a system, to say how much is born into the system, and when it leaves the system, how much dies. And within its whole life cycle, if we implement different waste mitigation strategies, how much plastic is reduced. So if we think about the amount of plastic that is going out into the environment to date and under business as usual, and then if we implement different mitigations, how much do we reduce, similar to CO2 emissions? And we do this along the life cycle of plastic, so I know you can't read that, but basically there's the things related to production and use. So can you put storm drains at production facilities to reduce the amount of resin going out into the environment? And then you have the waste management side. Can you increase waste management? What happens if you implement more recycling or have litter prevention? And then you might have tools once you're in the environment around cleanup, trash capture devices, these types of things. Trying to say if we implement these strategies, how much do we reduce by? It's a big, complicated project that I don't have time to talk about, but I would be really happy to share more with you when we have time, and there's a website that you can go to that Steph runs. Then we do some projects in our lab about thinking globally but acting locally, because the reality is that waste is managed, as you know, at a very local level. And so I think a lot of what we can do right here at home, which will impact the global problem. And so some of you may be familiar with Operation Clean Sweep. This is most relevant to producers of resin and converters. This is asking that companies stop the spillage of pellets and scrap from going down the drain and going out into the environment. The Canadian Plastic Industry Association gave me the list of the industries that were signed on to it in Toronto. And while there certainly are some, it's not all. And so we've been thinking about doing some work with the master's student at U of T to try to increase the participation in this program and see if it reduces the loss of pellets out into our environment. Also, Michael, who's sitting here from Litter Trap, has done some work on this, great work in New Zealand, and so I met him yesterday, and we were talking about maybe collaborating on something like that. So that's something we can do. We also test ways in which we can maybe reduce the amount of microfibers going out the back of the wash and into the environment. We have a washing machine in our lab. We do laundry and count the amount of fibers that come out of the wash at the end of the load. Haley and Jack did this project last summer. They're undergrad students. This paper is now published. What we did was we used the Cora ball and the lint lever, so different mitigation strategies you can purchase at the store right now. The Cora ball accumulates fibers as it's in the wash, and the lint lever traps the lint coming out the washing machine, and then there's a lint trap like you clean out a lint trap on a dryer. The filter works very well, and it reduces just under 90% of the fibers that come out the back of the wash. So if we do a quick back of the envelope calculation, we calculate about 90 to 138,000 microfibers per wash load. We know that the average household washes 219 washes per year. There's about 2 million households. And so if we count up all the microfibers by multiplying these together, and then multiply it by the amount that comes out of a wastewater treatment plant, knowing that about 99% of it goes into the sludge, we estimate that about 23 to 36 trillion microfibers go into the lake with final effluent per year. And so if we just strapped a filter on a washing machine, whether it's aftermarket or companies agree to do it, you reduce by 20 to 31 trillion microfibers going out each year. It's a simple solution, but it's not easy because you're asking washing machine manufacturers to change their line and put filters in the washing machine, so it's a tough challenge. Georgian Bay Forever has recently gotten funding to do a pilot in the small town of Parry Sound, where we're working with them to put filters at 100 homes and seeing whether or not that makes a difference at the wastewater treatment plant scale. So if you live in Parry Sound, which you probably don't if you're here at 7:15, feel free to grab a filter from us for free and participate in our study. The other thing is we've tested bioretention cells, or rain gardens, to see how well this type of storm drain technology would trap particles. It's no surprise that it would probably work very well. It's literally a filter. The water comes through at the inlet. It goes through this rain garden, which is literally a garden with soil and sediments and rocks. And then it goes out the effluent, or it goes out into San Francisco Bay in this case. And so we sample the inlet as well as the effluent, and we see about a 92% reduction in the microplastics coming in as coming out. And so this is a technology that can be tested. I know that there's a student also at U of T who's working with TRCA in their testing facility with bioretention cells as well to show that it works locally here at home. And then, of course, you can do community outreach. So we have branded ourselves the U of T Trash Team. We do community outreach events in the city. You can see Lauren right here, sitting at this table. We do cleanups. You're more than welcome to join us on a cleanup, help us lead a cleanup. Also, David Wright, who's here from U of T, leads cleanups as well in the Don River. We're both passionate about the Don River. And so there's lots that you can do with community outreach and education. And we have been in conversations with Ports Toronto and some others in the city about whether or not we can put some kind of technology in our watershed, not necessarily a trash wheel, something with the essence of a trash wheel. This one we call the trash bandit. It's a raccoon. It takes some trash. But the idea is, should we put some sort of technology out there that gets the litter, but also interacts with the community? You have this amazing opportunity to do both education and outreach and actual mitigation at the same time and collect data. So this is something we've been kind of chewing on for a couple years, and we'll see where we land with that. And I think with that, I'm done. Hopefully I have time for questions. This is just to show you what a plate of microplastic looks like. You can sit and look at it. It's actually kind of pretty. And hopefully we have time for questions. So thank you, everyone.